So, when James comes to power in 1685, it's into a monarchy that's very strong. In the last years of Charles's reign, he was at the strongest he had been. He had won the exclusion crisis and then he'd ruled without parliament for 4 years until his death. When Charles died, that kind of like really peak of the monarchy and their power. And James comes into that and therefore kind of starts his reign as a very strong monarch. Now, he calls Parliament and it is dominated by the Tory party. Now, remember, the Tory party were the ones who had fought to keep him in a line of succession. It's about 90% Tory. And that happened because obviously there was elections, and that happened because people of the country, they had supported Charles in those years of arbitrary rule. There'd been a very kind of strong pro Charles II feeling, and he had put Tories in positions of power across the country as local JPs, etc. And there was kind of a very kind of pro monarchy feeling in the country. And therefore the Tories were elected to that parliament because the Tories were the very pro-monarchy party, whereas the Whigs had been the ones trying to exclude James. You've got to remember though that the Tories are actually anti-Catholic. Even though they're pro-James, because they were pro-Charles and they're pro-divine right, they are actually anti-Catholic. So it's a really strange situation. When James comes to power, he promises that he is going to rule, as a constitutional monarch. He's going to abide by the laws of the land. And his first parliament is very positive with him. They give him £400,000 for the navy. They increase the amount of money he's allowed to collect through ordinary revenue. So they say he's allowed to collect up to £2 million a year through ordinary revenue. And they also say he can increase the size of the army. So they come, the beginning of James and his parliament is very, very positive. However, we have another event, which, well, a couple of events, which are these rebellions against him, where people start to kind of fear James a bit and fear his authoritarianism. So we have a rebellion in Scotland, which is Argyll's rebellion, and then we have a rebellion down south in Somerset, which is Monmouth's rebellion. Remember, Monmouth is Charles II's illegitimate son. Monmouth's rebellion is known as the Pitchfork Rebellion because it's mainly farmers. These rebellions are easily defeated, but what comes afterwards is probably more important, which is the bloody assizes. The assizes were the court cases to put the rebels on trial. And they're known as the bloody assizes because James ensured they were really harsh against the rebels. 250 executions, 800 people sent into slavery in the colonies. In the American colonies. And these are seen as very, very harsh punishments for what really was just some small rebellions. James is trying to assert his authority here, but this is seen as absolutism. In the last years of Charles II, there is accusations of absolutism against Charles II because he's ruling without parliament, but they're very minimal, really, he's just sort of not doing that very much wrong. He just doesn't call parliament for 4 years, and that was legal, and he doesn't really do that much to change anything. There is, throughout Charles II's reign, obviously there is accusations of absolutism when he's using his dispensing powers and his suspending powers, and at times when he has a standing army, but it's all kind of, it's never really serious accusations. We see here that people are starting to question James II and think he's an absolute monarch because of his very harsh treatment of rebels. Then he starts to use his dispensing powers quite extensively. So Charles II had used his dispensing power to allow James to practice his Catholic religion. So that was what he was using his dispensing power for. So you're basically exempting people from laws when you use dispensing power. But he used it more extensively. So he put 90 Catholics in the army into positions of power within the army. And obviously, you know, so that's quite extensively using it for 90 people to be allowed to be Catholic and also be in the army. This is when things turn sour with Parliament, when he uses his dispensing powers. And therefore, he adjourns Parliament. He doesn't dissolve them, he adjourns them because they are, you know, being quite anti what he's trying to do, which is put Catholics in the army. And he very much, obviously, they are Tories, they are anti-Catholic, and although they accept him, they do not want to accept Catholics in the army. We then move on to the Godden versus Hales court case. This is after Parliament have been adjourned. And this is basically, it was engineered by James. He forced this court case into being because he knew that once he'd won it, it would say that he was allowed to put Catholics in the army. So he engineers the court case Godden versus Hales, but then he realizes he's going to lose, and the court case, the judges are going to rule against him and say he can't put Catholics in the army. So he actually replaces a lot of judges to do this. So again, these is signs of James's sort of absolutism. He actually, although all monarchs had replaced judges at times, he replaces more judges than any other monarch, and he does it to win court cases like Godden versus Hales, which he'd engineered in the first place and only happened because he wanted it to happen, which allows him to then put Catholics in the army. So he does win that court case after he replaces the judges. All of these things are leading people to claim that he's an absolute monarch. He then puts more Catholics in the Privy Council, because after Godden versus Hales, it's kind of accepted that he can legally use his dispensing powers. So even though the Test Act is still in place and he shouldn't have been able to put any Catholics in positions of power, he uses dispensing powers and he puts Catholics into Privy Council as well. He then moves to try and take over more of that kind of local government. Most of the JPs across the country by this point were Tories, because Charles had used Quo Warranto himself to put Tories in positions of power so that they could help him run the country. James does the same thing, but to try and put Catholics in positions of power as JPs. And he replaces 250 JPs in only 1 year, in 86, with Catholics. This is obviously terrifying people because it seems like he's trying to take over the country and putting Catholics in these positions of power. What people fear is a Catholic takeover. You know, James is saying, no, I'm going to respect the Church of England. I'm going to leave the Church of England in place. I will leave it as a Protestant church, but I want to then bring more religious freedom in. And people are terrified that really what he's going to do is turn England back to being Catholic. Now, Quo Warranto is something that James had used. Sorry, James uses, but it's also something Charles had used. It is a legal process where the monarch can renew a town's kind of charter or a writ. A writ is a legal document, and each town in England had one of these kind of charter writs, and they are allowed to do this if they renew the charter or the writ through Quo Warranto. They are then allowed to replace the local officials. It was something that was allowed to be done, but was done very rarely. It wasn't meant to be done to every single town across the country all in one go. Things then start to get even kind of more, he gets himself into more situations in terms of religion when he brings out, well, first of all, he lets 1,000 Quakers out of prison. So people are still a bit scared of Quakers, even though by this point, that's ridiculous, because they declared pacifism and they declared that they would not get involved in any armed uprisings at all. And they were true to their word. They were genuinely peaceful pacifists by this point. But obviously people fear Quakers, they fear a Quaker takeover as well. And generally, the Tories don't really like Quakers because the Tories don't like anybody that's not an Anglican. The Tories are super Anglican, so they don't like what he's doing with the Catholics, but they also don't like that he's letting Quakers out of prison, and they do fear them. And they just, the Tories are just super, super Anglican, except obviously they do support James as the king, but obviously they're not very happy about all of this stuff. We also have the Declaration to Preachers, which is you are not allowed to criticise Catholics. So the preachers are members of the clergy, members of the church, and they are not allowed to criticise Catholics. And James did suspend people from the church. He suspended bishops for going against the Declaration of Preachers. But the big one is the Declaration of Indulgence. This is exactly the same as the one Charles II tried to bring in, that basically just got rid of all of the anti-dissenter and anti-Catholic laws. The Declaration of Indulgence brought in religious freedom and said anyone can have any religious meetings they want, they can do whatever they want religiously. The Declaration of Indulgence would have allowed Catholics to worship, and also any dissenter groups. People obviously then scared that this is also part of the Catholic takeover. James would have disagreed, and he argued at the time, no, he's just bringing in religious freedom for everybody, for all types of Protestant and all types of Catholic. So there was obviously people who did support all of these things. Catholics supported them, and obviously dissenters supported them too. All of the different dissenter groups like Quakers supported these measures. But most people in England were still Anglican. And during the reign of Charles II, most people had been very firmly anti-Catholic and anti-dissenter. The majority of people had been in the way inclined. The Whigs are different. So the Whig Party are anti-Catholic, but they're actually pro-dissenter, whereas the Tories, who are more kind of powerful at this time, the Tories are anti-both. But these are brought in, and so therefore, a time there is religious freedom within England from 1687. It's not going to last long though, because obviously James himself is removed. The other kind of big thing that's scaring people is what's going on in Ireland. Obviously, Ireland is majority Catholic. They had always been allowed to practice their religion, but they had been restricted in other ways. So they had not been allowed to be in the Irish Parliament. It had been very difficult for them to own land, and they had to pay a tax to the Protestant church, and they had not been allowed in the army. James changes all of that and puts a Catholic called Tyrconnell in charge of Ireland. And under Tyrconnell, Catholics can worship freely, they can join the army, they can be members of the Irish Parliament, and land ownership also massively increases. They also gain power in other ways, such as becoming teachers in schools and things like that. So the Catholic situation in Ireland massively increases. So obviously the Catholics really support James as their king. However, that then fear increases within England because people start to fear an Irish army maybe coming to England and helping James to do this feared Catholic takeover. Things then come to a head as we move towards 1688. 1688 is the Glorious Revolution, and when William of Orange comes and invades England and takes over, and James is forced to abdicate. Things had been bubbling for quite a long time. Things had been bubbling, obviously, throughout James being in power, all of the things he was doing, the bloody assizes, using his dispensing powers, putting Catholics in all these positions of power. The Declaration of Indulgence then becomes a big one. And in he reissues it. So in 1688, he actually reissues the Declaration of Indulgence to confirm, no, this is what is happening. Religious freedom is happening. Something that also obviously massively triggers things is the birth of baby James, so James's son. This is really a trigger point because up until the birth of baby James, the heir to the throne after James was Mary, who was Protestant, and then her sister Anne, who was also Protestant. So people had sort of been thinking, yes, we don't like James being a Catholic, but the next person coming is Mary. She is a Protestant, and therefore the birth of baby James, it changes the line of succession, and people start to realize, oh no, we're going to get a Catholic next. Even though James was getting old, baby James would inherit the throne from a very young age with a regent, and that might be James's wife Mary of Modena, who was a Catholic. So people start to fear the long-term Catholic succession. Also, obviously, James it reissues the Declaration of Indulgence in 1688, the same year baby James was born. And then that kind of fear re-emerges as well. And James goes one step further when he reissues the Declaration of Indulgence, and he says that Sancroft and all of so he was the Archbishop of London, and all of the other archbishops and all of the other bishops must read the Declaration of Indulgence from every church across the country. This basically, when something was read from the front of the church, that was basically understood that it would be that was basically law. That's only when things were read really from the pulpit is when they were actually law. Now, every church across the country was told they had to read out the Declaration of Indulgence. They had to make this announcement. And within London, you have Sancroft, but also who's Archbishop, but also 6 other bishops within London, and they are saying, no, we don't want to do this. And they said it wasn't even because of what the Declaration of Indulgence said, it was because it hadn't been agreed by Parliament. They said the Declaration of Indulgence wasn't law. And James argued that he was going to call a new Parliament, and the Parliament would make it law, so it could be read out. But they were arguing, well, no, but it hasn't been made official law yet. It's just a declaration of that James had said. Until it was actually passed by Parliament, it wasn't a permanent law. So they were not even arguing with James about what it said. They were arguing about the legal point of view and saying that they shouldn't be reading it out and declaring it until it had been passed by a Parliament. James is furious and he locks them up. So this is a real trigger because he's locking up Anglican bishops because they won't do what he wants. So there's public outrage, and by this point there is an increasing number of kind of protests going on across the country against these things that James is doing, because it seems like an attack on the Anglican Church, especially when he locks up the bishops. It's an attack on the Anglican Church. Then there is a trial, because obviously he's locked these men up, and so it goes to trial. They are arguing that they shouldn't have been locked up and that they shouldn't have to read the Declaration of Indulgence because it's not proper law. And James is obviously arguing that they were disobeying him. Even though James had replaced all of the judges at one point or another, and all of the judges in theory were on his side, it was a not guilty verdict because they hadn't done anything wrong. Legally, they'd done nothing wrong. All they'd done is refuse to read something out that wasn't law, because the Declaration of Indulgence used James's suspending powers, but something isn't a permanent proper law until it's been passed by Parliament. So then they were let out. But this really shows us how much opposition to James there was by this point, that the judges won't even side with him, and they're saying, no, you're wrong, you can't arrest these men. He had dissolved Parliament in 1687, so the year before all of this was sort of starting to kick off. And he is going to call new elections, and he says that the new elections are obviously for a new Parliament. And then this Parliament would, pass the Declaration of Indulgence and make it law. That's what he said. But then he starts to interfere with the elections. And what he's trying to engineer is obviously Catholics being put into this new Parliament. This, again, absolute outrage. Parliament's elections are meant to be free. The monarchy is not meant to involve themselves in elections at all. It's meant to be the choice of the people and not meant to involve him at all. Obviously, you know, elections were very limited anyway. When we say the kind of political nation, we mean that very small amount of men that can vote and the small amount of men, rich landowning men, that can be elected to Parliament. But even though it wasn't full democracy and the political nation was small, it was still meant to be completely free from the intervention of the monarch. What we really see then is between 1685 and 1688, a series of actions of James that people see as attacking the Church of England, as absolutism, as, you know, the signs that he's planning a Catholic takeover, of using his powers extremely harshly, and treating people wrongly, you know, executing people, arresting people, and using his suspending and dispensing powers completely excessively. As a result of all of these things, we have what we call the Anglican Revolt. The Anglican Revolt is when a group of Anglicans, known as the Immortal Seven, wrote to William of Orange to tell him that they were dissatisfied. They didn't ask him to come and, you know, take over the country. They didn't write anything as treasonous as that. They asked him to come over and investigate the legitimacy of baby James, because they were kind of trying to suggest that maybe baby James wasn't James's son. I mean, he was, but that's what they were sort of suggesting, that maybe because James hadn't had a child in such a long time, maybe he was illegitimate. I mean, the reason he was born is because James remarried to a very young woman, but that's one of their kind of excuses of why they wanted William to come. And obviously, if baby James was seen as illegitimate, then he wouldn't be the heir to the throne. Mary would again. But then the other thing that they want him to come and try and do is ensure free elections and make sure James doesn't interfere with elections. But they know what they're doing. They know by inviting William over to come over, he's going to bring an army and he's going to come and take over, because William of Orange is Mary's husband. Mary was the heir to the throne. She's James's daughter, and William always assumed that eventually his wife would become Queen of England. So he's pretty annoyed that she's not going to be. So he's quite happy to come over. But the Immortal Seven know exactly what they're doing, and even though they don't write it in the paper, on the paper, they know exactly what they're doing. And interestingly enough, the Immortal Seven are mainly Whigs, but there is also a couple of Tories in there as well. So this really shows us how far the Tory party have come. The Tories were the ones who were against exclusion, and they fought to put James on the throne. You know, they were the ones who supported James coming to power. And now we see that a couple of the Immortal Seven are actually Tories. So once James was in power, he even turned the Tories against him. They're not willing to do an uprising themselves, though. The people in England don't want another civil war, and they're not willing to try and overthrow their own king. But what they see is an opportunity to get a foreign power to come in, who is obviously connected to the English throne through his wife, and overthrow the monarch for them without saying it. And then after they have written to William sends kind of like ambassadors, envoys over to England to, you know, greet baby James. But really what they do is they meet with the Immortal Seven. Bishop Sancroft is one of the Immortal Seven. So, you know, these people who've been kind of wronged by James, and and then they meet with them and they kind of make plans, and then obviously eventually William then sends over an army, and that is the end of James.